April 26, 1478. Medici Palace, after the attack. Rumors fly through the streets of Florence. There's been an affray at the cathedral. The young Medici brothers were slain as they knelt at prayer. Foreign mercenaries are entering the city. Jacopo Pazzi is leading family retainers through the streets, and bodies of men lie in the city's squares, torn apart by mobs. No one knows what to do. If the Medici brothers still live, moving against them is a death sentence. However, if they're dead and the Pazzi now rule, any pro-Medici mobs will be ruthlessly suppressed. So people gather outside the Medici palace, waiting to hear news. Then suddenly, the balcony doors open, revealing Lorenzo Medici. With a weak voice, he announces the death of his brother Giuliano at the hands of Pazzi assassins, also stating that despite wounds, he can continue his civic duties. "My people," he says, "I commend myself to you. Control yourselves and let justice take its course. Do not harm the innocent." The crowd roars in response. They don't want justice. They want blood. Thank you so much to our patrons over at Patreon, whose monetary support not only makes our videos possible, but who also vote for topics we cover, like they did with this Murder in Florence series you're watching right now. To learn how you can vote on the shows we make, click the link below. When the Pazzi assassins attacked the Medici brothers, a lot of things began to happen at once, and a lot of those things were bloody. So just a quick warning up top, this episode does get pretty brutal, so viewer discretion is advised. The raising of the communion host was done in sync with the toll of the cathedral bell, which put the whole plan in motion. Outside the city, a mercenary force from Imola, sent by Pazzi conspirator Girolamo Riario, began to enter the city. Nearby, 600 troops of Federico de Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, who you can learn more about here, stood in readiness to go in and keep the peace after the initial assault. The overwhelming force should have been enough to enter Florence easily, but as the vanguard entered the city, it met not crowds crying to be liberated, but rather mobs of determined citizens throwing cobblestones and rocks. Florentines were deeply proud of their republic, and the prospect of a foreign intervention enraged them. Given the resistance, the vanguard, mostly mercenaries, did what Italian mercenaries did when encountering resistance, that being they pulled back, because really there's no point in getting paid to fight if you don't live to spend it. And when they pulled back, the Urbino reserve simply left, because it turned out that Montefeltro's whole troop commitment was a ruse. He'd planned to betray his fellow conspirators and seize Florence for himself once the hard fighting was done, and it was clear that things were not off to a good start. Meanwhile, inside the city, Jacopo Pazzi was discovering much the same thing. He'd come home to take command of his troops and discovered his nephew Francesco Pazzi laying in bed with a self-inflicted wound in his thigh. Francesco confirmed that the deed was done, but he couldn't guarantee Lorenzo was dead. Jacopo had been nervous about this plan from the start. He'd refused to join it until Pope Sixtus threw in his backing, but the die was cast now. To survive, the Pazzi had to go all in. So, Jacopo mounted his horse and rallied the Pazzi troops that stood ready. At this point, there were already people gathering outside the Pazzi palace, a crowd he perhaps mistook as supporters, because he rode out crying, "Liberty! Liberty!" and proclaiming that the Pazzi had saved the Republic, though he couldn't have gotten far before it became clear that the crowd was in fact hostile. See, the Pazzi were not well liked in Florence. They were seen as aloof and imperious, in contrast to the Medici, who, even their detractors did have to admit, had raised the city's prestige. And now, the Pazzi had aligned with foreigners. They'd brought mercenaries into the city, but their crime was beyond political, for they had spilled blood in the cathedral during Mass in the presence of a visiting cardinal. And while many of the crowd disliked the Medici, they loved Florence, and the Pazzi had brought shame on the city. Of course, we don't know when Jacopo realized things were turning sour. Maybe he read the mood and got out of the city before it exploded, but we do know that he wasn't there when the blood started flowing. It began at the Palazzo Vecchio, the city's town hall. There, Archbishop Francesco Salviati sat waiting with his retinue of Pazzi footmen, all armed. He'd arrived not long after the cathedral bell had tolled and requested a meeting with the city's chief law enforcement figure, the Gonfaloniere of Justice. The plan was to take him hostage, paralyzing the city's security forces and capturing the government. But he wasn't coming. Retainers had apologized multiple times, saying the gonfaloniere was on his way, but that there was just a small piece of business that had to be finished first. As Salviati waited, he watched a crowd gathering outside, and if he felt a tingle that perhaps not all was well, he would have been right. The gonfaloniere had an odd feeling when Salviati arrived. Why was the archbishop here instead of mass? Why were his Pazzi retainers so heavily armed? And why was there a crowd gathering outside? So he sent a clerk to speak to the crowd and learned their news. Only then did he meet Salviati, though it was not the meeting the archbishop expected. The gonfaloniere entered, yes, but came along with a squad of armed guards with their swords already unsheathed and leveled. Soon Salviati and his accomplices were being beaten and questioned in the city hall's cells. Salviati supposedly confessed. But the crowd was not satisfied, because as word spread that Lorenzo lived, foreign mercenaries had tried to enter the city, and that the Pazzi were responsible, the city went mad. "I do not believe," said one witness, "that Florence had ever seen such a day of torment." Rioters stormed the Pazzi palace. They grabbed Francesco Pazzi from his bed and dragged him naked through the streets, beating and torturing him before delivering him to the gonfaloniere. Francesco denied all knowledge of the plot or any involvement, but that was no good, since Salviati had already confessed all. Outside, the crowd screamed for justice, and above them, a window opened, with Francesco Pazzi looking out, naked and shivering. Hands shoved him and he fell forward, clawing at the air until the rope around his neck pulled tight with a jerk and a snap of vertebrae. As he hung there, another window opened, and Salviati tumbled out on his own rope. His own death spasms were so violent, he reportedly bit Francesco's corpse, which the crowd took as a divine message the two were guilty. 3 more Pazzi men followed, before the gonfaloniere's men simply began to hurl Pazzi retainers out the windows, without ropes. The crowd tore into the bodies, literally ripping them apart with their bare hands and pocket knives. Some, in an act of extreme hatred, reportedly bit chunks out of the corpses and spit them on the street. The mob eventually found the pair of priests that had tried to kill Lorenzo hiding in an abbey, one disguised as a hermit. They only admitted their true identities after the crowd cut off their noses and ears, the mob proceeding to beat them half to death before finally lynching them. Rioters attacked suspected plotters and Pazzi relatives at random, putting heads on stakes in front of the Medici palace and piling severed limbs in front of the door. The Medici did little to curb this violence, though Lorenzo did dispatch Medici to rescue 2 members of the Pazzi family who he believed innocent, as well as the teenage cardinal, yet the mobs killed on. This was vengeance, yes, but also desperation. Florentines were so eager to prove loyalty to the Medici, and thus avoid any official reprisals, that they used slaughter as a tool of political communication. They'd do anything to prove they abhorred the Pazzi and their actions. Estimates vary, but contemporary chronicles claim that 50 people associated with the Pazzi died on the day of the assassination plot. Months of executions would follow. And the first of those executions was Jacopo Pazzi. While he had escaped the city, it became clear there was nowhere he could go for protection, so he rode back to meet his fate. They hanged him in his noble clothes, his hands bound with a white belt. For hanging was a dishonor, a fate reserved for criminals. In fact, the artist Michelangelo, age 3, watched the killing from atop his father's shoulders, forming one of his first memories. The Medici allowed Jacopo to be buried in the Pazzi vault, but even then he did not rest easy. For when rumors spread that Jacopo had commended his soul to the devil, Florentine mobs disinterred his corpse and threw it in a ditch at the edge of town. There, local boys found it and dragged it naked through the streets. The body they threw into the river, but the head, that they nailed by its hair to the door of the Pazzi palace. And for days, they used it as a door knocker, banging on the gate and telling those within that their lord had returned to his home. But that would not be the last of the killings, for Medici agents were fanning out across Italy and beyond to find the few who'd escaped. And Pope Sixtus was about to retaliate for the violence by starting a war and excommunicating all of Florence. But we'll get to that next time. Say, do you have an idea for our next extra history series? Or maybe just want to support our ability to make historical videos? Then please join our Patreon by clicking here to suggest topics, vote on future shows we make, and help keep the history flowing. And then once you're all signed up, check out our next video here. Thanks so much. Oh my god, I'm so glad I caught you. Did you know that Angelo Valenciana, Arclight Games, Dominic Valenciana, Foxdoc, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuyakoi, and Ziliad Architectures were the best legendary patrons? Well, now you do.